you, ma'am.
Well, we're continuing our coverage here of the Kotak Committee's recommendations to improve corporate governance across boards in India. Joining us here on the show is one of the members of the 21-member committee, Arun Kumar, the chairman of KPMG in India. Thanks very much for joining us on the show. It's a 177-page report with many specific recommendations, from the minimum number of directors on a board of companies to gender diversity, attendance of directors, disclosure, and several other key recommendations. How different is this from the current provisions, and what has been the thinking within the committee as you've spearheaded these recommendations?
First of all, it's a very talented committee, ably led by Kotak. And as he says in his preface to the report, the idea of improving corporate governance here was focused on a concept of moving from a monarchical model, a Raja model, as they put it, to a custodian model, which is like the Gandhian model of trusteeship. So the idea of serving all stakeholders, having a governance that serves all stakeholders, was very much the motivation behind this 171-page report.
So, as you said, the recommendations try and move corporate India from a Raja model to a trusteeship model. But let me ask you specifically about some of the recommendations and how different they are from the current provisions. A minimum number of directors on a board, I believe currently there are no specific provisions. You're proposing 6 minimum directors. Gender diversity, and this one, more power to the committee, at least 1 woman director, and this time you're very categorically stating an independent director. In terms of attendance of directors, there is currently no specific provision. You're saying they must attend at least half of the meetings over a 2-year period. And this is also, I think, very important in the context of what we see happen on Indian boards. Disclosure of expertise and skills of a director. Currently, again, no specific provisions, but you're now proposing that boards must have a matrix setting out the skills and the expertise and the competence of a particular member related to the industry that they serve in.
Right. So really a board has 2 big purposes. One is the fiduciary to all the stakeholders. The second is adding value to their investment in some sense, to strategic thinking and so forth. For the latter aspect, if you don't have the right mix of expertise, the board cannot do its job. And then fundamentally, the board must do its job. They've got to be enough members to attend meetings, have quota, etc. They've got to attend the meetings. They've got to be mechanisms in which they can evaluate themselves on how the board is performing. So the whole idea of the report in the board section was to strengthen the role of independent directors, to move towards having a separate chairman and chief executive over time, and really emphasizing that independent directors and boards have a great responsibility in improving corporate governance.
Why did you feel the need to say that the woman director must be an independent director?
Well, because the whole idea, there's the idea of independence and there's the idea of diversity. So independence means it's not a director that belongs, say, to the family of the promoter. Which is what we've seen happen. Which often happen, and it seemed to make more sense to really bring about the concept of independence. Clearly, you wanted an independent woman as opposed to just a woman.
In terms of also seeking disclosures from companies as to why independent directors have resigned, is that a gap that you felt also needed to be plugged, given what we've seen happen in the recent past across corporate India?
I think information is really an important currency of governance. Stakeholders need to know why things happen, and sometimes they need to go below the cover as to why things happen. So it's important that, in the view of the committee, it was important that there was disclosure of why a director would resign. Is that a sign of something not going well in the company? Is that a sign of, was that a personal decision? And is it genuinely a personal decision?
I think one area where there continues to be concern is how many boards can you be on. You've actually increased the number from the current number is about 7. I think you've gone to 8, if I'm correct. Do you believe that that's too much?
Well, I think the important issue really is to serve the boards that you're on. So it's important that directors are deeply engaged in the business of their company.
What reaction do you expect from corporate India, and how I know that the committee has tried to make this practical and balance it with pragmatism as well. Do you believe that this is going to be accepted by corporate India?
I would think so. I think it's a really nice move in the right direction, and I think the committee has done a nice job of balancing important principles with a practical application. How can it actually be done, and over what time frame? So the committee went to great lengths to lay out a time frame for implementation, which I think is very practical.
What, to your mind, would you say are the biggest changes that this committee is proposing to make by way of the recommendation?
I would say one is strengthening the role of the independent director and putting a very big focus on the role of the independent director. In that context, strengthening the role of the board itself by demarcating the role of the chairman over time with the chief executive, so that the board is not synonymous with management. I think that's probably the biggest contribution. There are many supporting contributions in terms of dealing with how the board and the audit committee reviews certain kinds of transactions that are core to good governance. The topics covered like auditor oversight and accounting oversight. It's a pretty comprehensive report.
On one of the specific recommendations that you make, and that has to do with the separation of the roles of the non-executive chairperson and the managing director and CEO. Again, currently there is no specific provision. You're proposing to change that by April 1, 2020. How difficult is this one going to be in specific?
It's actually not an easy one. And frankly, in many countries, it's not the case. Like the United States, it's very common for the chairman and CEO to be the same. In Europe, they've moved in a different direction. So there are positives and negatives. The committee felt that in the Indian context, it would make a lot of sense to have a chief executive that's different from the chairman.
Why is that?
Because it demarcates the role of management, namely the chief executive, and the board that's led by the chairman.
How much of the recommendations that this committee has put forward have taken the shape that they have because of the concerns of ownership and management commingling, not necessarily in the best interest of all stakeholders in India?
Yeah, I think that was probably one of the root motivations of why the committee was set up. I would expect that one of the motivations was that SEBI wanted to be quite clear that this issue of addressing motivations of minority owners or maybe even majority owners compared to the benefits that all shareholders were seeking, that there can be often conflict in that area, and the committee tried to address through good governance principles how companies should be managed.
So do you, and a lot of people that we've been speaking to say that, these recommendations are fine, but they shouldn't be made mandatory, and self-regulation is really the best medicine or the best remedy. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think self-regulation is generally a good thing, so that you don't have to have kind of law-based regulation. So the more we can self-regulate in many areas, the better. But at the same time, there are many areas where you do want to have some standards, and the committee was recommending certain standards for corporate governance that I think will really move the ball forward for India.
So any particular, insights from what's happening in the rest of the world that the committee took note of while you put these recommendations together?
I would say that the committee's thinking was very contemporary. The committee did a lot of study of what are best practices in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and so forth. So we looked at a wide gamut of contemporary practices and tried to pick which were the ones that were best for India, and which were the ones that could be implemented in a reasonable time frame.
Which are the recommendations that you believe will be perhaps the hardest to implement?
Well, all the recommendations in some form or other take some work. So it's not, they're serious recommendations, so they would take some work.
If all of this were to be accepted in the manner in which you've proposed, how different do you believe the corporate governance culture will be in India?
I think corporate governance is something that's going to be constantly evolving. So I think this is a nice step. It's not a revolutionary step, just an evolutionary step, but it's an important evolutionary step in increasing the standards of corporate governance in India.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18, and congratulations for getting the report done. Well, that's one of the members of the Kotak Committee report. As we pointed out, over 170-page report giving us a sense of what corporate governance could look like in India. For now, it's back to you guys in the studio.